The Spencer Mansion incident is where everything in Resident Evil begins. Not just the first game, everything. The T-virus escaping into the world, Wesker's betrayal, the Tyrant program going live for the first time. It all starts here. In this video, I'm covering the complete story of what happened at the mansion. We're going to reconstruct the whole incident from the outside. What Umbrella was doing before S.T.A.R.S ever arrived. What Wesker was actually planning. What was living under that mansion. The full picture, not just what the player could see. Before we get into it, I want to ask you something. Would you also like a version of this video that follows the story exactly the way the game tells it? Room by room, discovery by discovery, the way you'd experience it as a player. Let me know in the comments. If enough of you want it, I'll make that video too. In May 1998, reports of cannibalistic murders began to emerge from the Arklay Mountains. Local families were being attacked in their isolated homes by groups of assailants. The victims showed signs of being partially consumed while still alive. These incidents created a state of panic within the suburban community of Raccoon City. The local authorities were unable to find a rational explanation for the extreme violence. The killings were characterized by a predatory nature that baffled the standard investigators. The physical evidence suggested that the attackers possessed a frenzied strength and a total lack of human restraint. Witnesses described sightings of distorted figures moving through the dense forest at night. These reports were initially dismissed as urban legends or animal attacks. However, the increasing body count forced the city administration to take the threat seriously. The Raccoon City Police Department eventually realized that their standard patrol units were insufficient for the rugged terrain. They decided to deploy their elite S.T.A.R.S unit to locate the suspected cult of serial killers. This special forces team was trained for high-risk operations and hostage rescue. The public believed that the intervention of professional soldiers would end the mountain terror. The city viewed the mission as a standard criminal investigation into domestic terrorism. Umbrella Pharmaceuticals used its influence to monitor the police response from the beginning. The corporation knew that the cannibalistic murders were a direct result of a containment failure. They allowed the local media to sensationalize the story, to provide cover for their biological disaster. The Arklay murders served as the public introduction to a viral threat that would soon consume the entire region. The mountain range became the first battlefield in a new kind of biological war. The outbreak at the Arklay laboratory was not a technical accident. It was a deliberate act of sabotage committed by the resurrected James Marcus. And Marcus was a founding member of the corporation who had been assassinated by his own colleagues years prior. He was brought back to life through the biological intervention of the Queen Leech. This parasitic organism merged with his DNA, granting him control over the local Leech population. Marcus sought absolute revenge against Oswell Spencer for his past betrayal. He used his parasitic abilities to infiltrate the sewage systems and the ventilation shafts of the mansion facility. In May 1998, he leaked the T-virus into the internal environment. This action ensured that the researchers and the security staff were exposed to the pathogen. Marcus wanted to watch the corporate empire collapse from the inside. The leakage caused a rapid deterioration of the internal containment systems. The T-virus spread through the air and the water supply, infecting every living host in the laboratory. The brilliant researchers were transformed into mindless zombies who began to consume their own co-workers. Marcus observed the chaos with a clinical satisfaction, knowing that the project was now out of control. He had turned the pride of the corporation into a biological tomb. This deliberate failure also affected the local wildlife and the experimental animals. The virus escaped into the surrounding forest through the infected waste and the fleeing staff. This led to the creation of the monsters that started the Arklay murders. The Queen Leech functioned as the catalyst for the entire disaster. The outbreak was a personal vendetta that utilized 30 years of viral research as a lethal tool. Bravo Team was the first S.T.A.R.S unit sent into the mountain range on July 23, 1998. The team consisted of experienced officers such as Enrico Marini, Forrest Bayer, and the rookie Rebecca Chambers. Their mission was to locate the source of the killings and secure the forest perimeter. However, their helicopter suffered a sudden engine failure shortly after departure. The aircraft was forced to make a crash landing in the middle of the woods. The engine failure was likely the result of internal sabotage intended to isolate the team. Once on the ground, the officers were immediately scattered by the dark environment and the hostile wildlife. They discovered a derailed transport vehicle belonging to the MP and an abandoned train known as the Ecliptic Express. The Bravo team was forced to engage multiple biological threats without any support from the city. They were entering a zone that had already been compromised by the virus. As the night progressed, the Bravo members were systematically hunted by the creatures in the forest. Enrico Marini attempted to maintain tactical order, but the team was spread too thin. Some members sought refuge in the nearby training facility, while others were killed by the infected animals. By the time Alpha Team arrived, the Bravo communications were dead. The first unit had been effectively neutralized by the biological reality of the forest. The silence of Bravo Team served as the trigger for the next phase of the corporate plan. Wesker used their disappearance to justify the deployment of Alpha Team into the mansion grounds. The Bravo officers were the sacrificial lambs, used to gauge the lethality of the local organisms. Their ordeal provided the initial combat data that the corporation required. The bravery of the first unit was exploited by a traitor who was already recording their deaths. Alpha Team was considered the premier squad within the S.T.A.R.S organization. The roster included Chris Redfield, who served as a disciplined marksman and a former Air Force pilot. Jill Valentine was the team expert in mechanical bypass and explosive ordnance. Barry Burton provided the heavy firepower and a deep knowledge of tactical weaponry. These members were the most capable tactical officers in Raccoon City. The team also included Joseph Frost, who managed the technical maintenance of the equipment, and Brad Vickers, the designated pilot. Albert Wesker served as the commanding officer, leading the team with a cold and calculated efficiency. Each member brought a specific skill set that made the squad a unified machine of war. They were trained to handle urban terrorism and extreme combat scenarios. This level of expertise made them the perfect subjects for a controlled experiment. Wesker chose these specific individuals because of their high survival instinct and their combat experience. He wanted to see how the most elite human soldiers would react to the biological superweapons. Chris and Jill were the primary focus of his observations, and as they possessed the best physical and mental attributes. The Alpha Team was a collection of high-value assets that were about to be discarded. Their professional history meant nothing to the corporate agenda. The public view of Alpha Team was one of total confidence. The citizens of Raccoon City believed that these heroes could solve any crisis. However, the squad was entering the mansion with a fundamental disadvantage. They were being led by the very man who had designed their destruction. The Alpha Team roster was a list of names that Wesker intended to cross out as the night progressed. As a secret operative for Umbrella, Albert Wesker possessed total knowledge of the mansion facility. He had spent years working as a researcher alongside William Birkin before transitioning into the police department. Wesker understood the viral strains, the creature locations, and the security protocols of the Arklay lab. He was not surprised by the reports of cannibalistic murders. He was the architect of the police response to them. Wesker had a detailed mission parameter that was separate from the S.T.A.R.S objectives. He was ordered by the corporation to retrieve the combat data of the biological weapons and destroy the evidence of the leak. He carried a digital map of the mansion and a list of specific targets for his observations. Wesker was a professional who viewed his own team as biological sensors. He was there to record the performance of the BOW line against live targets. Before the helicopter even left the rooftop, Wesker had already coordinated with his corporate handlers. He knew about the Queen Leech and the failure of the Ecliptic Express. He had prepared himself for a planned defection from the company, intending to steal the data for a rival organization. Wesker was playing a triple game involving the police, the corporation, and his own future. His preparation was absolute, and his loyalty was non-existent. Wesker maintained a facade of concern for his missing Bravo team colleagues. In reality, he viewed their deaths as the opening act of his experiment. He encouraged the Alpha Team to move quickly into the danger zone to maximize the stress of the encounter. Wesker was the only person in the forest who was not in danger. He was a master of the environment who was leading his friends into a house of biological death. Immediately upon landing in the forest clearing, Alpha Team was ambushed by a pack of Cerberus dogs. These infected Dobermans moved with a coordinated speed that overwhelmed the team initial defense. Joseph Frost was the first to be targeted, torn apart by the creatures before he could draw his weapon. The sudden violence of the attack shattered the tactical composure of the unit. The team realized that they were facing something far more dangerous than human cultists. Terrified by the sight of the monsters, Brad Vickers panicked and took off in the helicopter. He abandoned his teammates in the middle of the dark forest, leaving them with no means of extraction. This desertion forced the remaining 4 members to seek immediate cover. They were pursued by the pack through the dense trees, with the sounds of the creatures closing in from all sides. The mission had transformed from a search operation into a desperate flight for survival. The team spotted the looming silhouette of the Spencer mansion and decided to make a sprint for the front doors. They entered the main hall just as the dogs reached the entrance, slamming the heavy wooden doors shut. Chris, Jill, Barry, and Wesker were now trapped inside a massive silent estate. They were isolated from the outside world and cut off from their transport. The mansion was the only safe harbor they could find, but it was actually a biological cage. This initial attack served Wesker purposes perfectly. The death of Joseph Frost provided the first data point for the Cerberus effectiveness in a forest environment. The desertion of Brad Vickers ensured that the team would be forced to explore the mansion to find a secondary exit. The experiment was now in its active phase. 4 elite soldiers were locked in a labyrinth with 30 years of viral horror. The night had officially begun. The Spencer Mansion was an architectural masterpiece designed by George Trevor in the late 60s decade. It featured a grand main hall with a sweeping staircase and expensive marble floors. The interior was decorated with classical art, antique furniture, and complex mechanical clocks. To a casual observer, it appeared to be a luxury estate for a wealthy pharmaceutical executive. However, every room was designed with a specific and lethal purpose. The mansion functioned as a massive biological puzzle box. George Trevor had built the facility with hidden passages, pressure-sensitive traps, and elaborate mechanical locks. These features were intended to protect the entrance to the underground laboratory, located deep beneath the gardens. The estate was not built for human comfort, but for tactical security. It was a test of spatial reasoning that could kill anyone who made a single mistake. Hidden behind the classical facade was a network of surveillance cameras and sensors. The corporation used the mansion to monitor the behavior of the residents and the guests. The puzzles were a way to filter out unauthorized personnel, while ensuring that only those with the correct keys could progress. The mansion was the physical manifestation of the Spencer obsession with control and secrecy. It was a beautiful mask for a dark industrial heart. The rooms were filled with the evidence of the recent outbreak. Blood-stained corridors and broken windows showed that the mansion staff had been consumed by the virus. The luxury of the estate created a visceral contrast with the rotting corpses that now inhabited it. The S.T.A.R.S members were not entering a home. They were entering a biological processing plant. The mansion was the gatekeeper for the most dangerous research in human history. While exploring the dining room hallway, the team discovered the body of Kenneth Sullivan from Bravo team. He was cornered in a narrow passage, being actively consumed by a pale, distorted figure. This encounter is known as the moment of the first zombie. The creature was a former researcher who had lost all higher brain functions and was driven by a primitive hunger. The sight of a human being eating another human was the team's first true confirmation of the biological horror. The S.T.A.R.S members attempted to engage the creature, discovering that it possessed an unnatural resilience to gunfire. Even after being shot multiple times, the zombie continued to advance with a single-minded focus on the team. This was the moment they understood that they were not fighting serial killers or cultists. They were facing reanimated corpses that had been transformed by an unknown pathogen. The tactical reality of the mission shifted from law enforcement to survival. Kenneth's death was a significant blow to the morale of the survivors. He was a veteran officer who had been reduced to a meal for a mindless monster. The team recovered a videotape from his body, which recorded his final moments of struggle. This evidence provided a terrifying glimpse into the speed and the aggression of the infection. The Alpha team realized that every shadow in the mansion could hold a similar threat. Wesker observed this encounter with a clinical interest, noting how the team reacted to the sight of the undead. He was pleased with the initial performance of the T-virus zombies. They were effective at inducing fear and draining the ammunition of the soldiers. The death of Kenneth Sullivan was a necessary sacrifice for the collection of the combat data. The mansion had claimed its first Alpha Team victim, and the night was still young. Part 9. Enrico Marini, the Bravo captain who discovered the traitor and was silenced for it. Enrico Marini was the respected captain of Bravo Team. and the lead investigator of the Arklay murders. While his squad was being decimated in the forest, Enrico managed to infiltrate the deeper levels of the mansion tunnels. He used his tactical experience to uncover the evidence of the corporate conspiracy and the existence of a double agent within S.T.A.R.S. Enrico realized that the entire mission was a setup designed to sacrifice the officers for the sake of experimental data. As he reached the underground passages, Enrico was severely injured and exhausted from constant combat. He attempted to warn Chris and Jill about the traitor, but he was unable to reveal the name before a shot rang out from the shadows. Wesker had tracked Enrico's movements to ensure that the conspiracy remained hidden. The captain was silenced by his own superior officer, proving that the betrayal was absolute. Enrico's death removed the last tactical authority who could challenge Wesker. The loss of Enrico Marini was a pivotal moment in the investigation. He was the officer who held the key to the betrayal, and his silence forced the survivors to find the truth on their own. His final words created a sense of paranoia within the remaining Alpha Team members. They realized that the danger was not just coming from the monsters in the halls. There was a human threat moving through the darkness who was far more dangerous than the zombies. Wesker viewed the assassination as a clinical necessity. He could not allow a high-ranking officer like Enrico to return to the city with evidence of the corporate crimes. The death of the Bravo captain was a clean tactical move that secured Wesker's position as the master of the environment. Enrico Marini died as a hero who was attempting to protect his team. His sacrifice was the final proof that the corporation had no loyalty to its own employees. Part 10. Rebecca Chambers. What she had already survived. Before Alpha Team arrived. Rebecca Chambers was the 18-year-old rookie and medic of the Bravo team. Despite her lack of field experience, she had already survived a massive ordeal before the Alpha Team reached the mansion. She had navigated the Ecliptic Express and the Umbrella training facility, facing off against the Proto-Tyrant and the Queen Leech. By the time Chris Redfield found her, she was a battle-hardened survivor who had witnessed the total collapse of her team. Rebecca's presence in the mansion was a biological miracle. She had managed to treat her own injuries and evade the larger predators using her knowledge of chemistry and medicine. She was a valuable asset who provided Chris with essential information about the Bravo team final hours. Her rookie status was a deception. She was one of the most capable survivors in the forest. Her resilience proved that the corporation had underestimated the human element. Wesker viewed Rebecca as a minor variable in his experiment. He was surprised that she had survived the training facility incident, but he did not see her as a threat to his ultimate goal. He allowed her to assist Chris, knowing that her medical skills might keep the test subjects alive longer. Rebecca represented the unintended consequences of the outbreak. She was a survivor who was gathering the evidence needed to destroy the corporation. Her story in Resident Evil Zero provides the context for her exhaustion in the mansion. She had spent the last 24 hours in a state of constant combat. Her meeting with Chris was a moment of tactical relief, but she knew that the nightmare was far from over. Rebecca Chambers was the bridge between the two facilities, carrying the truth about James Marcus into the heart of the Spencer estate. Part 11. Splitting up. How the investigation divided and what each character was finding. Shortly after entering the mansion, Wesker encouraged the team to split up and search for clues. This was a tactical maneuver designed to isolate the members and make them more vulnerable to the creatures. By dividing the squad, Wesker could monitor their individual performances against different types of BOW assets. He wanted to see how Jill and Chris handled the puzzles and the monsters without the support of a full tactical unit. As they explored the mansion individually, the characters began to discover the true nature of the facility. Jill found the evidence of the chemical research and the hidden traps in the guest house. Chris uncovered the diaries of the dying researchers and the logs of the animal experiments. Each member was piecing together a different part of the corporate conspiracy. The mansion was revealing its secrets through the blood and the paper trails left behind by the dead. The isolation created a psychological pressure that affected the team decision-making. Every creak of the floorboards and every groan in the distance was a potential threat. They were forced to manage their limited resources while solving complex mechanical puzzles. This environment was a perfect simulation of a hostile combat zone. Wesker was extracting the maximum amount of data from the division of the team. While the survivors were finding evidence of a crime, Wesker was finding evidence of a product. He used the chaos to access the secret terminals and begin the download of the lab digital archives. The splitting up of the team was the final act of his management. He was leaving them to the monsters while he prepared for his own ascension. The Alpha team was no longer a unit. They were individual rats in a biological maze. Part 12. George Trevor, the architect who built his own prison and never escaped. George Trevor was the brilliant architect hired by Oswald Spencer to design the mansion in the 1960 decade. He was a man who took pride in his complex mechanical puzzles and his intricate hidden passages. Spencer rewarded his genius by imprisoning George and his family within the very structure he had built. Spencer wanted to ensure that the secrets of the mansion layout would never leave the grounds. Trevor was a victim of the corporate obsession with absolute security. George spent his final days wandering the hidden tunnels and the secret rooms of the estate, trying to find a way out. He discovered that Spencer had altered the puzzles to trap him in a state of permanent isolation. In a moment of supreme irony, Trevor found a hidden tomb in the gardens and realized it was his own. His name was already carved into the stone. He died of starvation and exhaustion in a pit he had designed himself. The tragedy of George Trevor served as a warning about the nature of the corporation. They viewed even their most talented human assets as disposable tools. The mansion was a physical manifestation of George's genius, but it was also his final resting place. His diaries, found by the S.T.A.R.S members, provided a heart-wrenching account of his slow descent into despair. He was the first person to be consumed by the Spencer mansion. George's death ensured that only those with the proper knowledge or the correct keys could navigate the facility. He had built a prison that was so perfect that even its creator could not escape it. The mansion was a monument to his skill and a tomb for his family. The S.T.A.R.S officers were walking through the architectural ghost of a man who had been erased by the very company he helped to build. Part 13. Lisa Trevor. 30 years of experimentation and what her survival actually meant. Lisa Trevor was the daughter of George Trevor, and she suffered a fate far worse than her father. After being kidnapped by Spencer, she was used as a primary test subject for various viral strains for over 30 years. Her body possessed a unique genetic resilience that allowed her to absorb and survive the progenitor virus, the T virus, and multiple other experimental pathogens. She became a distorted, immortal nightmare that wandered the mansion grounds in a state of permanent agony. Lisa's survival was the key to the discovery of the G virus. William Birkin and Albert Wesker observed that her body had successfully integrated the various viruses into a new, more powerful mutation. She was a biological treasure chest that contained decades of research. However, the cost of this survival was the total destruction of her mind. She wore the faces of her victims as a mask, obsessed with finding her mother. She was immune to standard gunfire and environmental hazards, making her the most dangerous creature in the mansion. The S.T.A.R.S members could not kill her. They could only temporarily stun her or evade her. Lisa represented the absolute peak of the corporation cruelty. She was a human being who had been transformed into a biological commodity. Her existence proved that the company was willing to sacrifice an entire life for the sake of a single breakthrough. Lisa Trevor was the ghost of the Arklay lab. She was a reminder of the original sins of the founders. Her tragic story provided the emotional core of the mansion incident, showing the human cost of the T-virus project. When the mansion was destroyed, she was finally granted the peace that had been denied to her for 3 decades. She was the most important and the most tragic subject in the history of the corporation. The mansion was filled with a paper trail of diaries, logs, and memos left behind by the dying staff. These documents provided the S.T.A.R.S members with a chronological account of the outbreak. The most famous example was the diary of the keeper, who documented his slow transformation into a zombie. His final entry, itchy, tasty, became the definitive symbol of the viral infection. These files were the voices of the victims reaching out from the grave. The researchers also left behind technical data regarding the creature experiments. Jill found the files on Plant 42 and the Neptune sharks, which detailed the mutation process and the feeding schedules. These logs proved that the monsters were not natural accidents, but intentional products of viral engineering. The paper trail linked the pharmaceutical company directly to the creation of biological weapons. The evidence was irrefutable and massive. John, a high-level researcher and the boyfriend of Ada Wong, left behind letters that detailed the internal politics of the lab. He spoke of his growing suspicion toward the management and his fear of the virus. His documents provided a human perspective on the scientific arrogance that led to the leak. The paper trail transformed the mansion from a house of horror into a crime scene. The S.T.A.R.S members were gathering the legal proof needed to bankrupt the corporation, and Wesker attempted to destroy as much of this evidence as possible. But the scale of the documentation was too large. The dead had left behind a legacy of guilt that could not be erased. The paper trail was the ultimate weapon used by the survivors to tell the truth to the world. It proved that the corporation was a criminal organization disguised as a medical giant. Every file found in the mansion was a nail in the coffin of the Spencer Empire. Part 15. The Arklay Laboratory. Why this was never just a murder investigation. Deep beneath the luxury of the mansion lay the Arklay Laboratory, a high-tech facility dedicated to the perfection of the T-virus. This was the nerve center for Umbrella North American research operations. It featured cryogenic tanks, advanced computer terminals, and high-security containment cells. The lab was designed to produce the next generation of biological superweapons, away from the prying eyes of the public. The primary product of this facility was the Tyrant project. The researchers were working to create the ultimate life form, a controllable super soldier that could follow complex orders. The lab also produced various secondary weapons, such as the hunters and the web spinners. The Arklay facility was a factory of death, where the biology was a commodity and the human soul was an obstacle. It was the cradle of the series' iconic monsters. The lab was powered by a massive self-destruct system, intended to erase all evidence in the event of a total failure. It was a clinical environment where the scientists worked in white coats while the creatures screamed in the dark. The contrast between the clean laboratory and the rotting mansion above was absolute. The S.T.A.R.S members discovered that the pharmaceutical company was not making medicine. They were making gods for the black market. The discovery of the lab was the climax of the investigation. It was the moment the survivors realized the global scale of the threat. The Arklay laboratory was the source of the plague that would eventually destroy Raccoon City. It was the physical heart of the conspiracy, and its destruction was the only way to stop the spread of the virus. The basement of the mansion was where the future of humanity was being rewritten in blood. The zombies encountered within the Spencer estate were not random monsters, but the former staff of the Arklay laboratory. Their presence served as a clinical record of the total containment failure within the facility. These individuals were once high-level researchers and security personnel who succumbed to the initial T-virus leak. The transformation stripped away their cognitive functions, leaving only a primitive drive to consume fresh genetic material. This was the first time the organization's primary pathogen was observed operating in an uncontrolled environment. The biological decay seen in these subjects proved that the T-virus was capable of rapid transmission through both fluid contact and airborne vectors. In the confined spaces of the mansion, the infection spread with a systematic speed that ignored all safety protocols. The skin of the hosts suffered from necrotic rot, while the muscular system maintained a horrific level of resilience. This confirmed that the virus could preserve a body long after the clinical death of the brain. The researchers had become the very subjects they once studied under microscopes. This specific outbreak proved that the T-virus was fundamentally unstable without a compatible host. While the zombies were effective at spreading the plague, they lacked the tactical intelligence required for a professional weapon. The mansion halls were filled with the groans of the undead, creating a psychological pressure that tested the S.T.A.R.S members. The transition from a human being to a mindless consumer was the most basic and terrifying result of the Arklay disaster. It was a visceral display of corporate negligence on a massive scale. The presence of these creatures also highlighted the airborne nature of the infection in the early stages. The researchers had been exposed to the virus through the ventilation system, ensuring that almost no one survived the initial breach. The mansion staff was effectively liquidated by their own research before they could trigger the emergency exits. This created a closed loop of infection that remained contained within the mountain range until the arrival of the police teams. The zombies were the silent witnesses to the fall of the Arklay Empire. So the behavior of the mansion's zombies provided the first combat data on the T-virus effectiveness in a closed environment. They utilized the narrow corridors and the dark rooms to ambush the S.T.A.R.S officers, forcing them to expend limited ammunition. Even in their mindless state, the sheer volume of the undead created a logistical nightmare for the tactical unit. This confirmed that the virus could win a war of attrition through numbers alone. The former staff had become a biological obstacle that could not be easily cleared. Furthermore, the necrotic state of the researchers showed the extreme metabolic demands of the virus. The hosts were driven to eat because the infection was literally consuming their bodies from the inside out. This perpetual hunger was the primary engine of the outbreak's spread. The organization monitored this behavior from the laboratory terminals, recording the efficiency of the consumer cycle. The zombies were the foundation of the biological arms race, a primitive but lethal proof of the Spencer vision. Part 17. The Cerberus Dogs. The the first weaponized animals and what they proved. The Cerberus units, designated as MA-39, were the first successful attempt at weaponizing a canine host. By infecting Dobermans with the T virus, the researchers created a fast and aggressive predator that maintained a primitive pack mentality. These animals were intended to function as pursuit weapons, capable of hunting down fleeing targets in open terrain. The attack on the S.T.A.R.S team in the forest was the definitive field test for this biological asset. The results were immediate and lethal. The biology of the Cerberus allowed for a massive increase in physical endurance and raw aggression. The dogs could cover long distances without showing signs of fatigue, making them superior to standard military canines. Their viral mutation also hardened their hide, allowing them to survive injuries that would have killed a normal animal. The pack move, with a synchronized logic that suggested the T virus did not entirely erase the social instincts of the host. They were a professional upgrade to a natural predator. Umbrella used these creatures to secure the perimeter of the mansion and the forest trails. The presence of the pack ensured that no one could leave or enter the Arklay range without facing a lethal encounter. The dogs proved that the virus could adapt to different biological niches, turning a common pet into a tactical tool. The organization was no longer limited to human experimentation. They were rewriting the entire natural order. The Cerberus was the proof of a broader ecological threat. The psychological impact of the pack was a key component of their tactical value. The sound of the dogs moving through the brush created a sense of constant vulnerability for the human targets. Unlike the slow-moving zombies, the Cerberus could strike from the shadows and retreat before a counterattack could be mounted. This forced the S.T.A.R.S members to stay in a state of high alert, draining their mental and physical energy. The dogs were the perfect tools for environmental control. Combat data from the forest attack showed that the MA-39 could neutralize an elite soldier in seconds. The death of Joseph Frost was a clinical demonstration of the creature's speed and bite force. The researchers noted that the viral load increased the jaw strength of the host, allowing them to tear through tactical gear with ease. This confirmed that the Cerberus was a cost-effective and reliable weapon for the global market. They were the first successful animals in the corporate catalogue. The success of the canine project led to the exploration of other animal hosts, such as the infected sharks and spiders found in the facility. However, the Cerberus remained the most practical and mobile asset in the Arklay inventory. They were easy to deploy and required minimal maintenance compared to the more complex Tyrant models. The dogs were the silent guardians of the corporate secrets, a biological fence that kept the world away from the truth. Their legacy would continue in every future outbreak. Part 18. The Hunters. The upgrade that arrived. Mid-investigation and what it meant. Halfway through the night, Albert Wesker triggered the release of the Hunters, designated as M-121. These reptilian-human hybrids represented a massive jump in biological lethality. They were designed specifically to hunt and eliminate armored targets with a high degree of tactical precision. The appearance of these creatures signaled that the experiment had moved into Phase 2. The S.T.A.R.S officers were no longer just fighting for survival. They were being tested against a superior species. The Hunter was a masterpiece of genetic engineering, combining human DNA with reptilian traits. This resulted in a creature with a thick, scaly hide and massive claws capable of decapitation. They possessed a level of agility that allowed them to scale walls and perform lethal leaps from the darkness. Unlike the mindless zombies, the Hunter displayed a primitive tactical awareness. waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They were the first creatures in the mansion that felt like professional soldiers. The release of these assets was a calculated move by Wesker to increase the lethality of the environment. He wanted to see how the remaining members of Alpha Team handled a predator that was faster and stronger than themselves. The data gathered from these encounters was essential for the refinement of the Bull line. Every kill confirmed the viability of the hybrid project. The Hunter was the weapon that would eventually become the backbone of the organization's military sales. Biologically, the Hunter was a stable and efficient platform for the T-virus. It did not suffer from the necrotic decay seen in the human hosts, maintaining its physical peak throughout the night. The mansion had become a live fire range for the most advanced predator on the planet. The tactical response of the S.T.A.R.S team to the Hunters was a primary focus of the combat data. Chris and Jill were forced to use heavy weaponry and high-level tactics to survive the encounters. The speed of the creatures meant that a single mistake would result in an immediate fatality. This pressure provided the corporation with a detailed map of human vulnerability. The Hunters were the tools used to calibrate the lethality of the future Tyrant models. The presence of the Hunters proved that the corporation was capable of building a new race of soldiers from the ground up. They were not just infecting existing hosts. They were acting as biological architects. The Arklay lab was the cradle of this new evolution, and the mansion was the proving ground. The Hunter remained one of the most successful products in the company's history. Their appearance in 1998 was the start of a new era of biological warfare. Part 19, Plant 42, Neptune, Shan-Yorn. The experiments already loose. Before S.T.A.R.S got there, the mansion grounds were inhabited by several localized or accidental experiments that had achieved a massive size. Plant 42 was a floral mutation that had grown to consume an entire room in the guest house. It utilized its massive vines to snatch prey and drain their blood through specialized suckers. This organism proved that the T-virus could transform even sedentary plants into lethal predators. The growth was a result of the virus reacting with the local water supply and the discarded chemical waste. In the flooded basement of the circular building, the team encountered Neptune, a group of weaponized great white sharks. These aquatic predators had been infected to test the virus's effectiveness in a marine environment. The T-virus increased their size and their physical endurance, turning them into invincible monsters in the water. The failure of the containment tank allowed them to turn the laboratory into a private hunting ground. They showed that the organization intended to dominate every biological niche on the planet. Yorn was a massive, venomous snake that inhabited the attic and the library of the mansion. Its size was a direct result of a prolonged exposure to the virus, which caused a total failure of its natural growth limits. The snake was an accidental byproduct of the research that had become a dominant predator within the estate. It moved with a terrifying speed and possessed a lethal venom that could kill a human in minutes. The presence of Yorn highlighted the environmental chaos caused by the leak. These specimens represented the variety of the T-virus potential. They were not standardized weapons like the Tyrants, but they were lethal obstacles that tested the adaptability of the S.T.A.R.S team. The organization monitored these creatures as part of their environmental study. They wanted to see how the virus would interact with different species in an uncontrolled setting. The mansion was a microcosm of a world where the natural order had been completely erased. The survival of these creatures suggested that the T-virus provided a massive boost to the host's physical resilience. Plant 42 could resist fire and chemical attacks, while Neptune survived in a highly toxic environment. This data was valuable for the researchers who were looking for ways to improve the durability of their primary weapons. The accidental monsters were a source of unpredictable and useful information. They were the wild cards in the Spencer deck. Ultimately, these localized experiments proved that the corporation had lost control of the facility long before the police arrived. The mansion had been reclaimed by a distorted version of nature that was driven by the viral fire. The S.T.A.R.S members were walking through a hostile ecosystem that had no place for human life. The giant snakes and the mutant plants were the signs of a world that was being consumed by the Arklay research. The mansion was the first step toward a global ecological disaster. Section 5. Wesker's Betrayal. Part 20. Wesker's Real Mission. What Umbrella actually sent him to collect. Wesker's real mission was defined by the clinical extraction of high-value research data. The corporation had already decided that the Arklay laboratory was a lost asset following the T-virus leak. Wesker was ordered to oversee the total destruction of the facility, to erase the evidence of the breach. However, his primary objective was to collect the combat data of the S.T.A.R.S members as they engaged the biological weapons. This information was considered more valuable than the lives of the officers or the laboratory itself. The corporation wanted a detailed record of how their BOW assets performed against elite human combatants. Wesker acted as the lead observer, and utilizing the mansion's surveillance network to monitor every fight and every death. This data was essential for the marketing of the Tyrant project to global military clients. They needed proof that their super soldiers could win against the best tactical units in the world. The S.T.A.R.S team was the disposable benchmark for the corporate product. Wesker was also responsible for the retrieval of the final viral samples and the research logs of the Tyrant project. He was the link between the laboratory's past and the company's future. The mission was a cold, tactical assessment of the organization's success. Wesker moved through the mansion with a professional focus, ignoring the suffering of his subordinates to secure the digital archives. He was a corporate cleaner who was preparing to burn the house down. The betrayal of the police department was a necessary component of the plan. By leading the S.T.A.R.S into the mansion, Wesker provided the live fire conditions required for the data. He used his position as captain to manipulate the team into the most dangerous areas of the estate. The mission was a total exploitation of the officers' trust for the sake of biological research. Wesker was the only person who understood the true nature of the night, and he intended to be the only one to benefit from it. Wesker's mission parameters also included the elimination of any witnesses who could link the corporation to the outbreak. This was why he shot Enrico Marini and attempted to trap the survivors in the lab. He was a professional who understood the importance of secrecy for the corporate brand. The mission was a total success in terms of data collection, even if the facility was destroyed. Wesker had proven that the biological weapons were ready for the next phase of development. Ultimately, Wesker was not just an Umbrella agent. He was an operative with his own private agenda. He was using the corporate mission as a cover for his own defection. He intended to keep the most valuable data for himself to use as leverage with a rival organization. His real mission was the first step in his rise to power as an independent god. The S.T.A.R.S team was the ladder he used to reach the next level of his evolution. Part 21. Operation X-Day. The Parallel Umbrella Operation. Nobody on the team knew was running Operation X-Day was the internal code name for the systematic purge of the S.T.A.R.S unit. The corporation realized that the police team knew too much about the local incidents and posed a threat to the corporate secrecy. The plan was to use the mansion incident as a way to clean house by sacrificing the officers in a controlled combat environment. This parallel operation was running in the background of the murder investigation, directed by the corporate headquarters. Wesker was the primary executor of this lethal strategy. The operation involved the deliberate sabotage of the Bravo team helicopter and the manipulation of the Alpha team's deployment. The corporation wanted to ensure that the officers were trapped in the Arklay forest without any means of easy escape. This created the high-stress conditions needed for the biological tests. Operation X-Day was a clinical act of corporate liquidation, treating the police officers as sacrificial lambs for the sake of research. It was a total betrayal of the public trust. Wesker coordinated with the laboratory staff to ensure that the monsters were released in a specific sequence to maximize the data collection. The hunters and the Cerberus dogs were deployed as part of the operational tactical plan. Every encounter was a scripted event designed to test a specific capability of the BOW line. The S.T.A.R.S team was fighting for their lives in a world that was being managed from a corporate boardroom. The mission was a total fabrication designed to cover a massacre. The parallel operation also included the monitoring of the S.T.A.R.S individual performance. The researchers wanted to see which officers were the most resilient and how they adapted to the viral threat. This information was used to refine the psychological profiles of the future super soldiers. Operation X-Day was a way to harvest the best of humanity and turn it into data for a monster. The officers were being processed like raw materials in an industrial facility. The secrecy of the operation was absolute. Not even the high-level researchers in the mansion were fully aware of the plan to liquidate the police team. Wesker was the only person on the ground who held the complete operational map. He was the bridge between the corporate will and the tactical execution. The destruction of the S.T.A.R.S was a sign of the organization's absolute power over the city administration. They could erase a professional unit without any consequence. Ultimately, Operation X-Day failed because of the resilience of survivors like Chris and Jill. They managed to survive the Phase 2 tests and uncover the evidence of the conspiracy. This led to the eventual collapse of the organization's secrecy and the legal battles of the following years. The operation was a masterpiece of cold, tactical planning, but it underestimated the human drive to survive. The purge was incomplete, and the truth escaped the mansion. Part 22. Barry Burton's Manipulation. How Wesker turned one of his own men. Albert Wesker used a cold and effective psychological leverage to turn Barry Burton into an inside man. By threatening the safety of Barry's wife and daughters, Wesker forced the veteran officer to sabotage the team's investigation. Barry was a family man who valued his loved ones above his professional loyalty. Wesker recognized this weakness and exploited it to ensure he had a pawn within the unit. Barry was the tool used to lead Jill Valentine into various biological traps. The manipulation involved Barry providing false information to the team and leading them away from the secret entrances. He was forced to witness the suffering of his friends while knowing he was responsible for their danger. This created an intense internal conflict for Barry, who was a man of high moral character. Wesker monitored this emotional stress with a detached interest, viewing Barry as another biological sensor. The manipulation was a clinical display of Wesker's mastery over the human element. Barry was the one who lured Jill into the room with the falling ceiling and the encounter with Plant 42. He was acting under direct orders from Wesker, to ensure that the combat data for Jill was recorded. The betrayal was a weight that Barry carried throughout the night, leading to moments of hesitation and guilt. He was a victim of the corporate ruthlessness, forced to choose between his family and his honor. Wesker had successfully corrupted one of the most reliable men in the unit. The leverage was reinforced through regular communications via the radio. Wesker reminded Barry that his family was being watched by corporate agents in Raccoon City. This ensured that Barry remained a compliant tool for the duration of the mission. The manipulation proved that the corporation could break even the most elite soldiers through psychological warfare. They did not just use viruses to destroy their enemies. They used fear and domestic leverage. Barry was a broken man in a tactical vest. Ultimately, Barry managed to find the strength to defy Wesker in the final hours of the incident. He realized that the traitor intended to kill everyone regardless of their cooperation. Barry's atonement began when he saved Jill in the laboratory, finally choosing to protect his teammates over his fear of the company. His survival was a victory of human loyalty over corporate manipulation. However, the guilt of his actions would define his character for the rest of the series. The manipulation of Barry Burton was a significant part of the Mansion experiment. It provided the researchers with data on the limits of human loyalty under extreme stress. Wesker learned that the family unit was the most effective leverage for controlling a tactical asset. This information was used to refine the management of the organization's future private military contractors. Barry was the proof that anyone could be turned if you held the right key. Part 23. The Rival Organization. Who Wesker was actually working for and what they wanted. While Albert Wesker was officially an umbrella agent, he was already planning his defection to a rival organization. This third-party group was a massive conglomerate that sought to challenge the corporate monopoly on biological weapons. They wanted the research data from the Tyrant project and a viable sample of the T-virus to jumpstart their own BOW program. Wesker was the bridge they used to infiltrate the Arklay facility and steal the company's most valuable secrets. Wesker's plan was to use the destruction of the mansion as a cover for his own death. He intended to trade the combat data of the S.T.A.R.S and the Tyrant specifications for a high-level position within the rival group. He was a professional mercenary who understood that the pharmaceutical giant was a sinking ship. He saw the rival company as the future of the biological arms race. The Mansion incident was his audition for a new master who possessed even greater resources. The rival organization provided Wesker with the technical support and the viral strains needed for his plan. They were interested in the T-virus because of its potential to create a programmable army. They saw the corporate obsession with the Spencer dream as a weakness, and they wanted to turn the research into a purely industrial product. Wesker was the key to their success, a man who possessed the knowledge and the ruthlessness they required. He was the ultimate industrial spy. This third-party interest explains why Wesker was so focused on the digital download of the laboratory archives. He was not just erasing the evidence. He was stealing the blueprints for the next generation of war. The rival organization was already preparing to market the Arklay research to global military clients. Wesker was their primary operative on the ground, a man who was selling the soul of his former employer for a better contract. He was a ghost in the corporate network. The identity of this organization is linked to the HCF and other shadow groups that appear later in the series. They represented a new era of decentralized bioterrorism, where the weapons were a commodity for the highest bidder. Wesker was the catalyst for this change, breaking the corporate monopoly and starting a global arms race. He was a man of the future who understood that the world was moving toward a darker evolution. The rival organization was his path to godhood. Ultimately, Wesker's work for the third party proved that the prehistoric fire could not be contained by a single company. The research was too valuable and too dangerous to remain a secret. The defection was the start of a global proliferation of biological weapons. Wesker had successfully turned the Arklay disaster into a personal business opportunity. He was no longer a loyal soldier. He was a global power broker who held the future of humanity in his hand. Part 24. The Prototype Virus. What Wesker injected into himself and what he was betting on. Before the final confrontation in the laboratory, Albert Wesker injected himself with an experimental prototype virus. This strain was provided to him by William Birkin, his longtime research partner and friend. The virus was designed to rewrite the host's DNA upon the moment of death, granting them superhuman physical attributes and regenerative properties. Wesker was betting his entire life on the success of this mutation. He wanted to transcend humanity and become a god-tier biological asset. The injection was a calculated risk that required Wesker to be killed by a powerful force. This was why he released the T-002 and allowed the creature to impale him. The physical trauma served as the trigger for the virus to activate and begin the cellular rewrite. Wesker was a scientist who was using his own body as the final laboratory. He was the ultimate realization of the Progenitor Project, a being that successfully integrated the viral load without losing its mind. The prototype virus provided Wesker with a level of speed and strength that was far beyond any human limit. It hardened his bone structure and increased his reaction time to a near instantaneous level. He was no longer a man, he was a post-human evolution that possessed the predatory instincts of a tyrant and the tactical mind of an executive. This was the true goal of his betrayal. He wanted the power of the monsters he had helped to create. Wesker's bet was a victory of biological engineering. The virus successfully revived him after the mansion's destruction, granting him the red eyes and the superhuman power that would define his character for the next decade. He had successfully bypassed the natural limits of the species. This was the beginning of the Wesker legacy. A man who was a living bioweapon. He had turned his own tactical death into a rebirth of absolute authority. The virus also granted him a level of immortality that allowed him to survive environmental hazards and fatal injuries. He was the perfect hybrid of the organic and the tactical. This evolution made him the primary antagonist of the series, a man who was as dangerous as the pathogens he sold. Wesker was the only person who truly won the mansion incident. He had escaped the corporate leash and gained the power of a god. He was the architect of his own evolution. Ultimately, the prototype virus was the final secret of the Arklay laboratory. It proved that the goal of the Tyrant project could be achieved in a human host with the right genetics. Wesker was the 1 in 10 million match that the researchers had been hunting for 30 years. He was the physical proof of the Spencer dream, but he had no intention of serving the man who envisioned it. The fire was now his to control. Section 6. The Lab and the Tyrant, Part 25. The Arklay Laboratory. Why this was never just a murder investigation. The Arklay Laboratory was the technical cradle of the T-virus and the heart of the corporate conspiracy. Every major outbreak for the next 15 years, from Raccoon City to the global incidents of the 2010s, can be traced back to the research conducted in this basement. It was a high-security facility where the organization perfected the art of biological warfare. The laboratory was the source of the plague that would eventually consume the world. It was never a simple murder investigation. The facility housed the primary data for the Tyrant project and the various animal hybrids like the hunters. It was a massive industrial complex hidden behind the facade of a classical mansion. The laboratory produced the viral strains that were sold to military clients on the black market. It was a factory of death that turned the biology of the planet into a corporate product. The S.T.A.R.S members had stumbled into the nerve center of a global bioterrorism network. The lab featured advanced technology that was decades ahead of the outside world. Cryogenic storage, supercomputers, and high-grade containment units proved that the corporation possessed a level of power that was superior to any national government. The researchers worked in a clinical vacuum, ignoring the morality of their work to achieve the next breakthrough. The laboratory was the physical manifestation of the scientific arrogance that defined the 1998 era. The discovery of the facility shifted the stakes of the mission from local law enforcement to international security. The survivors realized that the corporation was a threat to the entire human race. The laboratory was the evidence they needed to expose the truth to the world. However, the complexity of the facility made it difficult to extract the data while the self-destruct system was active. The basement was a labyrinth of death that was designed to protect its secrets at any cost. The laboratory was also the site of the final battle against the T-002. It was the room where the corporation's greatest achievement was unleashed against its creators. The clinical environment of the lab served as a visceral contrast to the raw physical power of the super soldier. It was the room where the old world of the founders died and the new world of the biological god was born. The lab was the genesis of the modern nightmare. Ultimately, the Arklay laboratory was the original sin of the series. Its destruction signaled the end of the organization's secrecy, but the legacy of its research lived on in the blood of the survivors and the samples stolen by Wesker. The basement was the beginning of everything. It was the place where humanity was rewritten in the dark. The investigation into the cannibalistic murders was just the first step into a world of viral horror. Part 26, the T-011, evacuation, what Sergei Vladimir came to collect during the incident. While the S.T.A.R.S members were fighting for their lives in the mansion, a parallel operation was being conducted by Sergei Vladimir. He was a high-level Soviet colonel and a loyal operative who was sent to ensure that the corporation's digital legacy survived the disaster. Sergei was responsible for the evacuation of the Red Queen supercomputer and the data for the T-011 model. He was a shadow moving through the facility, extracting the most valuable assets before the self-destruct was triggered. The Red Queen was the central AI that managed the laboratory's data and security protocols. It contained the entire history of the company's viral research and the genetic blueprints for the future of the Tyrant project. Sergei recognized that the digital archives were more important than the physical facility. By securing the AI, he ensured that the organization could continue its work even after the loss of the Arklay lab. He was the guardian of the corporate soul. Sergei also oversaw the retrieval of the T-011 data, which was a specific variant of the super soldier designed for cybernetic integration. He moved through the underground passages with a private security detail, avoiding the police teams and the monsters to reach the storage units. His operation was a clinical success and conducted with a military discipline that surpassed Wesker's chaotic experiment. Sergei was the true professional who ensured the corporation survived its own failure. The evacuation of these assets proved that the organization was always prepared for a total containment failure. They had a backup plan for their backup plan. While the mansion was burning, the future of the biological arms race was being loaded into a transport helicopter. Sergei's actions ensured that the Talos project and the future Tyrant models would eventually reach completion. He was the man who saved the corporate fire from the ash of the mansion. Wesker was unaware of Sergei's presence, highlighting the compartmentalization of the organization's high-level secrets. Sergei was a loyalist who reported directly to Oswell Spencer, while Wesker was a traitor who was seeking his own path. The parallel extraction created two different futures for the viral research. One future was in the hands of a global syndicate, and the other was in the hands of a private god. The mansion incident was a buffet of stolen data for the world's elite. Ultimately, the T-011 evacuation was the most important event of the night for the corporation's longevity. It allowed the company to rebuild its research infrastructure in Russia and other secret facilities. Sergei Vladimir had successfully outplayed the tactical situation, leaving the S.T.A.R.S and Wesker to fight over the rubble. He was the silent victor who secured the digital legacy of the Arklay lab. The Reaper had been saved by the Colonel. Part 27. The T-002. Wesker releases the Tyrant and why it killed him. First, Wesker initiated the awakening of the T-002 specimen within the laboratory power room. This biological asset was the culmination of 30 years of genetic research. It stood as the definitive realization of the Tyrant project at that stage. Wesker intended to use the creature as a final combat test against the remaining S.T.A.R.S members. The activation of the tank was the climax of his tactical plan. He wanted the ultimate combat data before his planned departure. The T-002 was a superior organism that lacked a functional mental shackle. Unlike later mass production models, this prototype was governed by pure biological instinct. Upon its release from the cryogenic fluid, it perceived Wesker as an immediate threat to its autonomy. The creature did not recognize a corporate master or a scientific creator. It only recognized the person standing at the control terminal. The monster was a feral god in a clinical environment. The impalement of Wesker was a clinical display of the creature's speed and physical power. It struck with a single claw, piercing the tactical vest and the torso of the double agent. This moment defined the legacy of the Arklay project as a failure of control. The creator was liquidated by his own masterpiece before the combat test could officially begin. Wesker had underestimated the independence of the viral fire. The impalement was the final act of his human career. The biological independence of the T-002 proved that raw power was useless without a programmable leash. The specimen moved with a predatory grace that bypassed all human defensive maneuvers. It ignored the verbal commands of the dying executive to focus on the other humans in the room. The laboratory was now a cage with a loose god. The corporation had built a Reaper that lacked any loyalty to the red and white logo. The survivors were forced to engage the Tyrant in a confined space where evasion was nearly impossible. The data gathered from this fight was recovered by the Red Queen system before the facility was destroyed. It showed that the T-002 possessed a physical output that surpassed any other BOW in the catalogue. Every strike of the claw was a recorded success for the biological program. The monster was a professional success and a personal disaster for the staff. Did Wesker calculated for this trauma as part of his transition to a superhuman state? While the impalement was physically devastating, it served as the necessary trigger for the prototype virus to begin its work. He lay on the floor of the lab while the T-002 turned its attention to Chris and Jill. The death of the human executive was the birth of the viral god. The impalement was a troublesome but necessary detail in his evolution. Part 28. Wesker's Resurrection. What actually happened? After the T-002 struck him down, after the survivors fled the laboratory power room, the prototype virus began to rewrite Wesker's DNA. The physical trauma of the impalement acted as the catalyst for the cellular transformation. The virus repaired the damaged organs and reinforced the muscular system with a supernatural speed. Wesker was no longer a human being, but a biological hybrid of the T-virus and the human genome. He woke up in a room filled with the groans of the dying facility. The resurrection was a total success for the Birkin research. Wesker discovered that he possessed an increased strength and a near instantaneous reaction time. His eyes had transformed into a glowing red color, representing the viral saturation within his nervous system. He had successfully transcended humanity and gained the power of the monsters he helped to build. This was the birth of the series' greatest antagonist. He was a man made of meat and code. Wesker realized that he had achieved the goal of the Progenitor Project. He was a stable host who maintained his high-level intelligence while hosting a lethal pathogen. This evolution made him the most valuable biological asset on the planet. He moved through the crumbling lab with a cold focus, avoiding the self-destruct triggers to reach the extraction point. He had escaped the corporate leash and the human mortality in a single night. The resurrection allowed Wesker to operate as a ghost in the post-Umbrella world. He was officially dead, according to the police records and the corporate files. This granted him the freedom to build his own global network of biological assets. He was the only person who truly understood the potential of the Arklay research. The virus had granted him a throne of blood. He was the architect of his own dark destiny. This transformation also granted him a regenerative ability that made him nearly immortal. He could survive injuries that would have killed any other S.T.A.R.S officer. This power gap was the primary reason Chris and Jill would struggle to defeat him for the next decade. Wesker was a predator that stood at the peak of the evolutionary ladder. The mansion incident was the successful trial for his new existence. He was the god of the prehistoric fire. The resurrection was the final secret of the mansion incident. While the world focused on the explosion, Wesker was already planning his next move. He carried the data and the virus in his own blood. He was a living laboratory that moved through the shadows of the forest. The betrayal of his team was just the first step in his rise to power. The man was gone, and the Reaper was born in the dark of the lab. Part 29. The Rocket Launcher. The final battle and the destruction of the first Tyrant. On the helipad of the mansion, the T-002 made its final stand against the survivors. The creature had pursued the team to the roof, driven by a biological need to eliminate the remaining human targets. It had mutated further in response to the combat stress, developing a thick hide and a lethal speed. The survivors were trapped on the landing pad with no ammunition and no escape. It was the final test of the super soldier. Brad Vickers redeemed himself in this moment by returning to the facility in the helicopter. He dropped a specialized rocket launcher to the team, providing them with the only weapon capable of stopping the god. This intervention was the tactical turning point of the night. The survivors had to coordinate their movements to distract the monster while preparing the heavy ordnance. The battle was a visceral display of human teamwork against biological perfection. One shot from the rocket launcher was enough to vaporize the T-002. The explosion reduced the creature to a cloud of biological debris, proving that even a god-tier BOW had physical limits. The destruction of the specimen was a total loss for the Arklay laboratory project. The most expensive and the most advanced weapon in the catalogue had been terminated by a single explosive strike. The fire had been put out. The defeat of the Tyrant provided the survivors with their final escape. They boarded the helicopter as the mansion's self-destruct sequence reached its final phase. The death of the creature was the signal that the nightmare was ending. However, the data from this fight had already been extracted by Sergei Vladimir and the Red Queen. The corporation had lost the body, but they had kept the blueprints. The battle was a victory for the heroes, but a draw for the company. The rocket launcher became an iconic symbol of the struggle against the super soldier. It proved that human technology could still match the viral evolution in a direct confrontation. The destruction of the T-002 was the first time a Tyrant had been killed in the wild. It set the standard for every future boss fight in the series. The god was dead, and the humans were leaving the island of horror. Ultimately, the destruction of the first Tyrant was the definitive end of the 1998 incident. It was the moment the S.T.A.R.S members proved they were the best soldiers in the world. They had faced the absolute peak of the biological arms race and emerged as the winners. The helipad was the final altar where the corporation's ambition was sacrificed. The Reaper had been defeated by the officers of the RRPD. Section 7, Escape and Aftermath. Part 30, The Self-Destruct. Who survived, who didn't, and why. The mansion and the underground laboratory were leveled by a massive thermobaric explosion in the early hours of the morning. This self-destruct sequence was triggered to erase the evidence of the T-virus leak and the illegal experiments. The explosion was so powerful that it vaporized the facility and the surrounding forest, leaving only a massive crater in the mountain range. This act of corporate liquidation was the final cleanup for the Spencer Empire. The evidence was ash. Only 5 members of the original S.T.A.R.S deployment survived the incident. Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, and Rebecca Chambers escaped on the helicopter piloted by Brad Vickers. These survivors were the only witnesses to the true nature of the Arklay murders. They had survived 30 years of viral horror in a single night. Their survival was a biological miracle that the corporation had not intended to allow. The test subjects had escaped the lab. Most of the Bravo team and half of the Alpha team were officially listed as killed in action. Officers like Enrico Marini, Forrest Speyer, and Joseph Frost were lost to the monsters and the betrayal of their captain. Their bodies were never recovered, again as they were destroyed in the final explosion. The loss of these professional soldiers was a massive blow to the police department. The S.T.A.R.S unit had been decimated by the very company that funded its equipment. The self-destruct was a victory for the corporate lawyers. Without a physical facility or viral samples, the corporation could claim that the incident was a tragic accident or a domestic terror attack. They used the explosion to reset the narrative and protect the board of directors from legal consequences. The survivors were left with nothing but their word as proof. The mansion had been erased from the map, but the horror remained in the blood of the officers. The destruction of the mansion also killed the remaining biological assets that were loose on the grounds. Plant 42, Lisa Trevor, and the thousands of zombies were incinerated in the blast. This prevented the immediate spread of the infection to Raccoon City, buying the world a few months of peace. However, the viral load had already been extracted by Wesker and Sergei Vladimir. The explosion was a temporary shield that could not hide the growing rot. Ultimately, the self-destruct signaled the end of the Arklay era. The cradle of the T-virus was gone, and the project was moving into the urban phase. The survivors were now targets for the organization's legal and tactical departments. They had survived the mansion, but they were now entering a world where the company owned the truth. The explosion was the start of a global cover-up that would define the next several years. Part 31. Brad Vickers, the pilot who fled, and what that decision eventually cost him. Brad Vickers was the designated pilot of Alpha Team, who earned the title of Chicken Heart for his initial desertion during the K9 attack. His decision to flee in the helicopter left his teammates trapped in the mansion for the entire night. Brad spent the hours circling the forest, fighting his own fear while looking for a safe landing zone. He was a man of high technical skill, but low combat resilience. His survival instinct was his primary character trait during the 1998 era. However, Brad redeemed himself in the final hours by returning to the helipad to extract the survivors. He provided the rocket launcher that allowed Chris and Jill to defeat the T-002. But this act of bravery saved the lives of his friends and secured the evidence of the corporate crimes. Brad was no longer the coward of the forest. He was the man who finished the mission. He returned to Raccoon City as a hero who had faced the Reaper and lived. Ironically, his decision to stay with the police department led to his eventual death during the citywide outbreak. Brad was hunted down by the Nemesis as part of the purge of the S.T.A.R.S members. He was infected and killed in front of the police station, a victim of the very unit he had helped to save. The corporation did not forgive his survival or his intervention in the mansion incident. Brad's death was a clinical execution designed to send a message to the other survivors. Brad Vickers represents the human vulnerability within the S.T.A.R.S unit. He was a normal man caught in a biological nightmare. His redemption was a sign of the resilience of the human spirit, but his death was a reminder of the corporate ruthlessness. He had outrun the Cerberus pack only to be caught by the perfected hunter. His legacy is one of technical support and a final, defining act of bravery. The loss of Brad Vickers was the final nail in the coffin for the original Alpha Team. He was the pilot who had seen the beginning and the end of the Arklay tragedy. His death proved that no one who knew the truth was safe from the corporate reach. Brad had redeemed his honor, but he had lost his life to the biological war. He was the first of the mansion survivors to fall in the Raccoon City streets. Ultimately, Brad's decision to return to the helipad changed the course of history. If he had stayed away, the survivors would have died with the mansion. The world would never have known about the T-virus or the betrayal of Wesker. Brad Vickers was the accidental hero who allowed the truth to escape the forest. He paid for that decision with his life, but he died as an officer of the law. Part 32. What S.T.A.R.S knew when they left. The evidence and why nobody believed them. When the survivors left the smoking ruins of the forest, they possessed a total understanding of the corporate conspiracy. They knew that Umbrella Pharmaceuticals was manufacturing biological weapons and that Albert Wesker was a traitor. They had seen the labs, the viruses, and the thousands of human victims. They carried the research logs and the diaries of the dead researchers as proof of the crimes. The S.T.A.R.S members were the world's leading experts on the biological war. However, their evidence was almost entirely anecdotal and digital. Without a physical facility or a live viral sample, the Raccoon City administration and the public viewed their story as a wild conspiracy theory. The corporation used its massive political influence and its control over the local media to discredit the officers. The survivors were painted as traumatized individuals who were suffering from post-traumatic stress. The truth was buried under a mountain of corporate propaganda. The lack of physical evidence was a primary result of the self-destruct sequence. The corporation had successfully erased the crime scene, leaving only a pile of ash in the mountains. The legal department used this to their advantage, blocking every investigation and silencing every witness. The S.T.A.R.S members were fighting a war in a court of law where the enemy owned the judge. They were the voices of the dead that no one wanted to hear. Chris and Jill were suspended from duty and monitored by the city's corrupt leadership. They realized that the police department was infected by the corporate influence as much as the mansion staff. This forced them to act as independent operatives, starting a private crusade against the organization. The knowledge they gained in the mansion was the weapon they used to hunt the corporate elite. They were no longer civil servants. They were anti-bioterrorism specialists. The public's refusal to believe the survivors allowed the corporation to continue its research for several more months. This bought the company the time they needed to finalize the G virus and prepare for the urban test in Raccoon City. The disbelief of the world was a biological shield for the organization. The survivors were the prophets of the apocalypse, but they were shouting into a void of corporate greed. Ultimately, what the S.T.A.R.S knew was the most dangerous information in the world. It was a secret that was worth millions of lives. The survivors were the only ones who knew that the Reaper was real and that he lived in a white coat. Their knowledge was the foundation for the future of the series, a 50-year struggle against the prehistoric fire. They had seen the beginning, and they knew the end was coming. She's part 33. The cover-up, how Umbrella managed the story and what it brought them. The corporation managed the aftermath of the mansion incident with a clinical and total cover-up. They utilized their network of paid officials and media outlets to frame the incident as an accidental chemical explosion at a storage facility. They denied all links to the biological research and the S.T.A.R.S deployment. The organization used its financial power to bribe the families of the victims and the local politicians. The cover-up was a masterpiece of corporate damage control. The disbanding of the S.T.A.R.S unit was a key part of the strategy. The corporation convinced the city administration that the elite team was too dangerous and unstable for urban law enforcement. They were replaced by standard SWAT units that were easier to control and manipulate. This removed the only tactical threat to the organization's local operations. The heroes of the mansion were erased from the city's history books. The board of directors had successfully liquidated their most dangerous enemies. The cover-up bought the corporation the time needed to relocate their primary research assets to the secret facility known as Nest. They moved the G virus project and the Tyrant blueprints away from the mountain range and into the heart of the city. The organization was not stopping its research. They were just moving it underground. The mansion incident was treated as a localized failure that provided valuable data for the urban expansion. By discrediting the survivors, the company also protected its global stock price and its military contracts. They continued to operate as a legitimate pharmaceutical giant, providing medicine to the same people they were planning to infect. The cover-up was a sign of the company's absolute arrogance. They believed they were above the law and beyond the reach of the survivors. The organization had won the legal war in 1998. However, the cover-up was fundamentally unstable. The truth was still in the hands of Chris and Jill, who were working with international agencies to expose the company. The silence of the city was a temporary peace that would soon be shattered by the total collapse of Raccoon City. The corporation had bought a few months of secrecy at the cost of their own survival. The cover-up was the mask that hid the face of the Reaper. Ultimately, the management of the story proved that the corporation was a political entity as much as a scientific one. They understood how to manipulate the public perception and control the flow of information. The mansion incident was a trial run for the global cover-ups of the future. The company had learned how to hide a massacre in plain sight. They were the masters of the world, and the mansion was just a room in their house. Part 34. Why RE1 matters. The lab under the mansion was the beginning of everything. The Spencer Mansion is the genesis of the entire Resident Evil franchise. It was the place where the original sins of the founders were committed and the prehistoric fire was first harnessed. The laboratory under the estate was the heart of the biological arms race that would define the next 30 years. Every virus, every monster, and every betrayal can be traced back to the research conducted in that basement. RE1 matters because it is the blueprint for the apocalypse. The incident created the series' greatest villain in Albert Wesker. His betrayal and his subsequent evolution transformed him from a corporate operative into a global god. He became the face of the biological threat, a man who represented the absolute corruption of the human species. The mansion was his cradle and his proving ground. Without the events of 1998, the world would never have faced the refined evil of the Wesker legacy. The mansion also turned ordinary civil servants into the world's first anti-bioterrorism specialists. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine were forged in the fire of the Arklay lab. Their struggle against the organization became a 50-year crusade to protect humanity from the viral rot. They were the only ones who knew how to fight the Reaper. The survivors of the mansion were the foundation for the B.S.A.A. and the international resistance against biological weapons. The biological data gathered during the night served as the foundation for the future of the Tyrant project. The T-103, the Nemesis, and the Talos were all developed using the lessons learned on the mansion helipad. The organization proved that biological weapons were viable and profitable. The mansion was the industrial prototype for a new era of warfare. It was the moment the genie was let out of the bottle. RE1 established the atmospheric and narrative standard for the survival horror genre. The isolated mansion, the mechanical puzzles, and the slow-moving undead created a sense of dread that defined the franchise. It was a story of corporate greed versus human resilience. The lab under the mansion was the beginning of a nightmare that would eventually consume entire nations. It was the place where humanity lost its innocence and discovered its own end. Ultimately, the Spencer Mansion remains the most iconic location in the series because it represents the peak of the pharmaceutical hubris. It was a beautiful house built on a foundation of corpses. The lab was the engine of the plot, and its destruction was the first shot in a global war. RE1 matters because it is the story of how the world started to die and how a few people refused to let it happen. The mansion was the beginning of everything.